I visited 26 different countries across 5 different continents, and from frozen winters in Sweden to tropical storms in Colombia, every culture that I've come across has started their day with some sort of caffeine. As a matter of fact, 80% of the world consume caffeine daily. I myself started around 10 years ago and have used it pretty much every day since. And I guess for something that we are so reliant upon and that the majority of us will consume for most of our lives, very few of us know the benefits it brings for our physical and cognitive performances, or what the health benefits and health drawbacks are from consuming it at all. So let's find out. Like many people, I started drinking coffee in my late teens and kind of have done ever since. I've made some slight adjustments to do with the optimal timing after listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman, but to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure why I do that. I've just blindly followed the advice of someone so much smarter than I am. Caffeine is the most widely used performance enhancer in the world, but I've never really understood it the way one should understand a performance enhancer, and that is the sole reason why I wanted to put this video together. Whether you're sipping seemingly never-ending tea in Morocco or you're clutching that flask of hot water for your yerba mate, caffeine is everywhere. Being a social norm in pretty much every single country, I guess the question is which form is preferred? The further east you'll go, you'll find more people that favour tea, but interestingly, a lot of the caffeine-based rituals around the world favour coffee. For example, in Turkey, it's traditional to brew coffee unfiltered in a pot called a şezve. And then when you're finished drinking, your cup is inverted and the pattern left by the grounds is then read to predict the future in a process called tasseography. Or take Sweden, for instance, where fika is a daily ritual that involves drinking coffee and usually eating some sort of sweet pastry with a colleague or with a friend, taken as a chance to truly relax and unwind. This has no relation to the actual focus of the video. I just thought it was cool to see how a daily practice that we all share can be so different depending on where you are in the world. Whether it's tea or coffee you prefer, caffeine is the substance that you're after. And while there are a number of plants, berries, leaves, and beans that contain caffeine naturally, essentially there are 2 types: natural and synthetic. Natural caffeine has been around for centuries, with the first tea being tracked to 2737 BC, and coffee being discovered many years later by an Ethiopian shepherd who noticed the energizing effect that it had on his goats. This form of caffeine hasn't ever changed, so if that Ethiopian shepherd made you a cup, it would probably taste quite similar to the one that you make at home every day. Therefore, when asking the question on which form is best, we're essentially asking whether natural caffeine found in teas or coffees or synthetic caffeine found in energy and soft drinks is better. Synthetic caffeine as we know it was created in World War II by the Nazis to maintain a steady caffeine supply during war embargoes. To make it, we start with ammonia, which is converted to urea and then combined with chloroacetic acid to produce uracil. Some more processing turns this uracil into theophylline before finally adding methyl chloride to create synthetic caffeine. The fact that in its raw form, synthetic caffeine glows bright blue should show you just how potent this substance is. A fraction of a teaspoon can provide you with the exact same energy as a large black coffee. 2 teaspoons will kill you. But in terms of the effects once it's entered the body, there's been no discernible difference found between the effects of natural and synthetic caffeine. The main difference is in the nutritional value. As natural caffeine comes from an organic source, there will be additional vitamins, minerals, and cofactors such as antioxidants, which will bring around additional benefits above and beyond what synthetic caffeine can do. What we do have to look out for is the dosage of synthetic caffeine because it can be so potent, especially when you consider that the same volume of liquid as a natural caffeine source might have double the amount of caffeine. And so I would always check for this on the side of the can, especially when we consider that synthetic caffeine is absorbed much quicker than natural caffeine. So what does it actually do? Once it's entered the body in either form, it will bind to adenosine receptors in our central nervous system and in certain organs like the heart. And this binding then prevents the buildup of adenosine, which is a chemical that promotes sleep. Now this adenosine is still there and will still build up throughout the day, but the brain isn't aware as to the actual level because caffeine doesn't activate the receptor the same way that adenosine does. As a matter of fact, it doesn't inactivate it either, it just completely mutes it. Therefore, as caffeine wears off and starts to become inactive, the quantity of adenosine that starts to communicate to the brain that has built up becomes overwhelming, and this is where the caffeine crash comes from. Dr. Matthew Walker explains that the half-life of caffeine is around 5-6 hours. Therefore, if you consume 100 milligrams of caffeine at 12 p.m., between 5 and 6 p.m. you'll have around 50 milligrams of that caffeine still active in your bloodstream, and then by 12 a.m. you'll still have 25 milligrams active. And having caffeine active in your body when you're trying to fall asleep can have a number of different effects. The first being on your ability to fall asleep. As caffeine is a stimulant, it will likely impact your ability to fall asleep and then stay asleep. Now, there are certain people that will swear by having a coffee in the evening and they can fall asleep just fine. And even if this is the case, it's still been shown that caffeine can dramatically reduce the quality of your deep sleep. One standard cup of coffee, which is around 150 to 200 milligrams drank in the evening, has been shown to decrease the quantity of your deep sleep by around 20%. And this is the equivalent to effectively aging yourself by 15 to 20 years. So with these effects in mind, how should we be timing caffeine each day? Most people will consume caffeine very early on in the day to give themselves energy. But in reality, what happens here is you're just getting that buildup of adenosine start even earlier. And then all of this will release in the early afternoon in a massive crash, leaving you feeling very tired. You're not actually clearing this adenosine out. If you delay your caffeine intake by 90 to 120 minutes after you wake up, you will delay and probably even mute the impacts of this afternoon crash. A note here, when we say afternoon crash, we are not referencing the postprandial dip, which is a normal fluctuation in your sleep-wake cycle experienced after lunch. When we mention the afternoon crash, we are discussing what we mentioned earlier, the brain becoming overwhelmed at the quantity of adenosine suddenly becoming apparent, thus suffering the crash. The fact that the two of these do coincide, depending on when you have that caffeine, is where they get confused. We're never at zero adenosine, but sleep does clear a lot of it depending on the quality. Therefore, in the morning, we still do have that buildup, albeit probably the smallest buildup that we'll have during the day. Instead, what we should be doing is looking at our natural cycle of cortisol, which peaks in the morning. Now, we need to stimulate this cortisol by doing things such as taking a cold shower, getting sunlight into our eyes, or doing some sort of physical activity, because then what this cortisol is going to do is greatly reduce the amount of adenosine that we have in our system. So adenosine now cleared, we feel less sleepy. And so when this cortisol starts to wear off a little bit later on in the day, we will then get that adenosine start to build up again, and then we'll reach for that cup of coffee much later on. And because we're starting this adenosine masking a lot later on in the morning, we'll experience this crash later on in the afternoon. Now, because it's not coinciding with the postprandial dip right after lunch, we'll also feel a much less severe crash at the same time. Let's look at how these two differ. Sue drinks coffee as soon as she wakes up, and Bob focuses on stimulating his cortisol instead. Both have adenosine being cleared out while they sleep, but when they both wake up, Sue immediately drinks a cup of coffee, therefore masking that true buildup of adenosine much earlier and at a higher level of adenosine than Bob. Bob, on the other hand, will get some sunlight in his eyes and have a cold shower, therefore clearing out a lot more of his adenosine and delaying this feeling of sleepiness. When he's reached the same level that Sue had when she had her first cup of coffee, it's much later in the morning. And so if we look at the same time in the afternoon when this caffeine is wearing off, Sue's brain is seeing a much larger buildup, which will result in a much larger crash, especially if it coincides with her natural postprandial dip. Bob, on the other hand, will delay this crash to later on in the day, at which point you're already recovering naturally from the postprandial dip. And so his energy levels are naturally increasing, thus muting the effect of the crash. We can see the size of each crash by noting the difference here, between this dotted line, which shows the adenosine buildup communicated to the brain, and this solid line here, representing the true buildup. When it comes to your last dose of caffeine, it's recommended that you have this around 10 hours before you go to sleep to limit the effect that it has on your deep sleep. There is a ton of data supporting the idea that caffeine, if consumed in the appropriate dosages, can improve both mental and physical performance, mainly due to its effect on focus and concentration. This dosage is going to depend on your individual tolerance to caffeine, which, to be honest, I'm not sure how you measure, but we do have a range that we talk about when we mention that appropriate dosage, which is between 100 milligrams and 400 milligrams of caffeine. For reference, a 250 ml or an 8-ounce cup of coffee is around 100 milligrams of caffeine. The main way in which it increases focus and concentration is, as discussed previously, by blocking these adenosine receptors, therefore delaying this feeling of sleepiness and making us feel more alert. As well as increasing your focus and concentration, it has been shown that caffeine actually increases the efficacy and density of your dopamine receptors, thus increasing the total effect that dopamine can have within the body. It should be noted here that caffeine has no direct impact on dopamine production itself. When it comes specifically to increasing our physical performance, caffeine increases the amount of circulating epinephrine we have in our bloodstream, which leads to enhanced energy availability. The way in which epinephrine works is by triggering our fight or flight response, which increases our heart rate, increases the blood flow to the muscles, dilates our airways for more oxygen, and mobilizes stored fuel, hence the opportunity for greater physical performance. I definitely do want to dive into some of the health benefits that coffee brings. I want to see if this is because of the caffeine or if this is completely separate, but I'll save that for another video. I hope you've learned something from this. I know I definitely have. I'm going to be putting a lot more weight onto a cold shower in the morning now that I know the effect that it has on my adenosine levels. Next time, I'm going to be diving into a lot more around electrolytes, so I'll catch you then.